Mysterious. Well, hey y'all, welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. Hope everybody's happy and healthy this holiday season. I got a Bigfoot story for you. This one comes to us from Lucas, resident of Richmond, Virginia. Before we jump right in, I'd appreciate you smacking that subscribe button for me as always, and let's get into it. During the early 80s, while living in the region of Richmond, Virginia, I had more than a few associates, be they neighbors or coworkers, with whom I regularly hunted. Between the bunch of us, who by the way rarely hunted together at one time in a group, we had spent most of our time hunting our sister state of West Virginia, in and around the rolling hills and mountains of Appalachia. So much time had we spent in this region that during the early summer of 1982, I had decided to look into the availability of a small house and piece of land to be used as a lodge for me and the boys. It was during the course of a number of weeks that I had, via telephone, attempted to make contact with some realtors in the hopes of finding what I was looking for. I remember the day exactly, because it was my son's birthday, being May 2nd, that the phone rang. It was a gentleman returning my call from the previous day whose name was Jesse. On the phone, he sounded like a very old man, and he was quite certain that if he didn't have anything within his current inventory, he could most certainly find something to my liking. The following weekend, I took the drive to West Virginia with my partner, Bill, and met up with Jesse at his office. His office happened to be an enclosed porch attached to a very old plantation home, which just happened to be where he and his family had lived. As we knocked on the door and he opened it, I was amazed to see that he wasn't old at all, but rather a young man of maybe 45, who had the deepest, most gravelly voice that I had ever heard in my life. He invited us in, and after pouring us each a glass of sweet tea, said to us, "So you boys are looking for a hunting cabin, are you?" We told him all the reasons why, based mainly on how much we hunted around here, after which he paused for a moment and said this, "You know, fellas, it's one thing to walk into an area and hunt for a day. It's quite another thing to stay in an area when the lights go out." When he said that, Bill and I kind of chuckled while glancing at each other, after which I said to Jesse, "What makes you say that?" He looked at me square in the eye and said, "There are critters in them there here woods that man doesn't necessarily want to run into, with or without a gun in his hand." To me, this was the most bizarre beginning to a sales pitch that I'd ever heard of. If I didn't know any better, it sounded to me like he was trying to talk me out of it before we'd even gotten started. He stood up out of his chair and said to us, "I think that I have just the place for you. It's about an hour's ride from here. Let's get a move on." The three of us piled into a 1965 Cadillac Coupe de Ville that was in mint condition and headed off to see what he had to show us. As we approached a gravel cut-off of road, I quite literally had no idea where it was we had traveled to. I think that I'd seen maybe 2 structures, if you'd call them houses, in the past half an hour. So we were heading into this gravel road that was 1 car wide, winding back through and into the woods for almost 10 minutes before we broke out into an opening, in the middle of which sat a small log cabin on a stone foundation. We pulled up to the front and got out of the car as Jesse walked to the trunk and opened it. Bill and I were already walking around to the cabin when Jesse come walking up and handed me a gun, saying, "Let's go for a walk." Now, I'm going to ask you one simple question, and one only. When was the last time you were handed a gun when looking at a home? He handed me a .45 caliber revolver and had put a holster on himself with another similar handgun. I said to him, "What is this all about?" He simply said, "I will advise you both here and now never to travel in these parts unarmed if you value your life and your limbs." He then said it wasn't the people we have to worry about, but rather the critters. The cabin sat on the edge of what appeared to be an old farmstead that hadn't been plowed or used in 100 years. We began to walk out in the field, heading towards one of the wood lines. When we'd reached the edge of the field, we turned around, looked back in the direction of the cabin, simply amazed at the vastness of the property and density of the surrounding forest. Jesse pointed in one direction and said, "About a quarter-mile back into the woods, there's a clear running brook that runs right through a hollow on your land where all the bears, deer, and boogers go for a drink." I looked at him, and Bill looked at me. I asked him, "What the hell is a booger?" He said to us, "I figured I might as well tell you two fellas because you seem like two nice gentlemen. In these parts, we have what is known as the hairy man, or the booger, by the local folk. They're said to be by many a tall, formidable creature, covered from head to toe by hair and muscle, which have roamed around in these parts since before the white man came." We talked more about this, as you could well imagine, as we walked back to the cabin, when the conversation turned to that of the cabin having no power and only a well pump outside. I walked over and grabbed the handle on the well pump, and after a number of attempts, nothing came out. Jesse said it hadn't been used in so long that it may have lost its prime, but that if we wanted the property, he would have it working for us as part of the sale. The front porch had a huge padlock on it, and each of the 6 windows on the cabin were covered with 2 layers of chicken wire, which almost entirely obscured the glass from view. Jesse said that it was needed to keep unwanted visitors from gaining access to the cabin, because when you blow the candle out, you can't see the hand in front of your face. He opened the lock, and we went inside to what was basically 3 rooms with plank floors, and one had a door on it. There was a metal basin on a steel stand that I guess would be used for washing up, and a stone fireplace set in one wall. There was also no insulation and no interior walls to speak of, or refinements of any kind to be seen. This was as bare bones could be, and then some. Jesse said to us, "So what do you two gents think of this place as a starting point for our house hunt?" I told him that Bill and I were going to step outside and have a little private talk, if he didn't mind, and that we would be right back in. The asking price for the land and cabin, I might add, was $4,700, including 27 acres and the use of the surrounding land for hunting and fishing. Bill and I were in agreement that the boys would flip over this as a hunting lodge, but we both found this whole booger thing to be real unsettling, especially the way it had been told to us by handing me a gun as we went for a walk. The long and short of it was that we took the house for $3,900, with the well pump being made ready for use upon our signing of the deal. It was only 4 weeks after the deal had closed that myself and 2 other guys had gone to spend the weekend, doing a little small game hunting in the fields and surrounding woods. It was really more of a reconnaissance mission in order to better understand what exactly we had at our disposal in the surrounding woods. The first thing that we decided to do after stocking the cabin with gas lights, candles, cans of kerosene, and the like was to find the creeks of which Jesse had spoken. We'd walked into the woods for maybe a quarter mile when we came up on the side of an old moonshining still. Having never made a drop of shine, we all knew what it was we were looking at. It appeared to have been abandoned, being completely intact, relatively speaking. Although everything with the exception of the copper had been completely rotted away, the entire still seemed to have been just walked away from. We thought that whoever had been running it may have died, and it was just left there in the woods, abandoned for years, until we had discovered it. About 100 feet away from the still, we came upon the creek, which was, of course, the reason why the still had been built there. The creek was beautiful, and the water was fresh and clear. We were all kind of soaking it in. Then Steve started to point out all the tracks that were alongside the creek. They were indicative of just how many animals were taking advantage of it as a water source. The 3 of us were now walking along with our heads down, examining the tracks, when a loud, prolonged howl began to sound from deep within the woods. All of us kind of locked eyes and virtually said at the same time, "What the heck was that?" This howl was loud and prolonged, lasting almost 15 or 20 seconds before it ended, when everything had become suddenly very silent. Being in one accord as to what we had heard, we had all agreed that it must have been a mountain lion, none of us having ever actually heard one for ourselves. Having brushed off the howl, we began to once again scour the banks of the creek, looking at the tracks when Steve said, "Check this out, you guys." The 3 of us gathered around where Steve was pointing. We were looking down on what was 2 full and 1 partial track in the soft mud of a gigantic, bare human foot, one of which was virtually perfect and couldn't have been there for more than a couple hours, if that. Our estimation was that it was approximately 20 inches long and very wide, and the big toe was kind of hooked toward the inside of the foot. I must say to you that Steve was not privy to the conversations which Bill and I had with Jesse about the booger and the hairy man. But I knew, as I looked at Bill, that he and I were on the same line of thinking. That line of thinking being that the howl and the footprint belonged to the same creature, which was in fact the booger. When the sun had set, we'd been in the cabin for about an hour. Having brought some tools, we removed the chicken wire from the windows and actually managed to open one of them, breaking a panel of glass in the process. For the time being, we were taking care of our business in a ditch outside until such a time as we could have an outhouse renovation in the future. After the sun had well set, we stepped out of the front door onto what was the porch, and we couldn't even see the truck. That was parked only 20 feet away. When I say we couldn't see it, I'm not kidding. For not even a glimmer of a piece of chrome could be seen. It was so black out here that it was palpable. I had never experienced anything like it before in my life. That night, having bombed the entire cabin with bug spray before we hiked to the creek, we settled down for what we hoped would be a good night's rest. We'd hung a kerosene lantern from the ceiling and were on sleeping bags and fold-up cots on the floor. The position of my head was such that It was facing the direction of the window pane that had been broken while trying to open the windows during the day. It was late when I had awoke from my sleep. As I looked at my watch, it actually read about 3:05 in the morning. The odd thing was that a horrible stench was wafting through the missing pane of glass in the window, and I heard the water pump's handle moving up and down, maybe 2 or 3 times outside. The pump was about 20 feet from the cabin. It was located just beyond the only section of the cabin where there was no window to look out and see it from where I was sleeping. Not that I could have seen it without a flashlight anyway. Haven't just told you how dark it was, but whatever was moving the handle couldn't see me either as I got up. I crept over and poked Steve, who was shocked to see me looking down at him, and he said, "What's wrong?" I whispered for him to listen, telling him that something was pumping water from the well. We both sat quietly. The handle of the well began to creak once again. We both put our boots on and grabbed our lights and our guns. Bill was actually sleeping in the room which could be seen into from the viewpoint of the pump when outside. Steve and I crept low and slow across the floor. When we reached the door, we had our lights on, facing the floor, and burst out the door, turning the corner of the cabin with our guns in hand. We rounded the corner. Our lights met with the back of a gigantic, hair-covered monster fleeing into the darkness. It was only maybe 2 or 3 seconds that we both had seen it. But see it, we did. Steve fired 2 slugs from his shotgun into the darkness, and then all went quiet. Bill had jumped up at the sound of the gunfire and started shouting, "Where in the hell are you guys?" I told him we were outside when he made it out for himself. We told him we just fired 2 shots at this monster, and the 3 of us had all gathered together back inside the cabin and began to iron out the details of what had just happened. Steve and I had a clear look at the rear of this beast, even though it was brief. We were in agreement that it was at least twice the height of the well pump, which itself was over 4 feet tall, and it seemed to be some 5 to 6 feet wide at the upper back. During the remainder of the night, none of us had slept a wink, and we had told Steve all as it pertained to our first day's meeting with Jesse and what he had told us about the booger in the woods, as he called it. Only now, Steve had seen the booger and Bill hadn't. Being still asleep when we ran out the front door in pursuit of the beast. At first light, we were out the door and looking around by the pump for evidence of what had taken place during the night. There were dozens of deep impressions made in the damp soil surrounding the well, and they were exactly the same as those we had seen by the creek during the previous day. This thing was so obviously watching and knew the sound of the creaking well's handle which we'd been using. Perhaps it was familiar with it as a water source and was investigating the fact that it was now working again. Whatever the case may be, this booger knew how to work the pump, which to me was very unusual behavior for any type of animal. That day, we packed up all our gear and headed back to Jesse's home office. When we arrived, he was there and invited us in, as we immediately began to tell him of all that had transpired the day and night before. He was not surprised, but rather shocked at what we had experienced and how quickly it had occurred. He said that usually these boogers had to warm up to the people and their activities before they began to make themselves known, but this critter had come in like a flood the very first day that we had arrived. I told him that I wouldn't be keeping the property and asked if he would handle putting it back up for sale, to which he agreed. As of this day, The property has still not been sold, and I have not as so much had an offer for $1 on it. Since that day's encounter, we have never gone back to the land, and I have written it off as a total loss. Well, ain't it too bad these guys ain't into chasing Sasquatch? I just may have to do some digging. Nobody offered him a thing and he's written it off. Well, written it off? What does that even mean? I mean, he's still got the deed to the property. Maybe he'd be willing to make a deal. And if anybody's looking to find a Sasquatch, know where to send them. Well, that's all for today. If you've had a Bigfoot encounter, or anything of the like, or anything mysterious for that matter, I'd love to hear about it. As always, shoot me an email at cryptidmysterious@gmail.com, and I will see y'all in the next one. Appreciate y'all.